When a girl spilled her lunch, a millionaire CEO's unexpected move silenced everyone. The cafeteria smelled faintly of pizza and overcooked vegetables, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as their pale glow spilled across dozens of crowded tables where students leaned over trays, talking with mouths full, swapping snacks, and scrolling through their phones while somewhere near the vending machines, a group of boys laughed loudly at something on one of their screens, the clatter of trays and squeaky shoes echoing against the tiled walls. In the far corner, the lunch lady poured juice into plastic cups, barely glancing at the line of restless students, while at the double doors, Emma stepped inside, holding her tray as if it were made of glass, her sneakers barely making a sound as she moved with the quiet precision of someone who wanted to be invisible. A simple sandwich, wrapped in clear plastic, sat at the center of her tray, beside a small red apple polished just enough to shine under the harsh lighting, and a carton of milk still beaded with condensation. To Emma, this wasn't just lunch, it was the only meal she could truly count on that day. Her eyes flicked across the cafeteria, scanning for an empty table, but most were packed with laughing groups and animated conversations until she spotted one in the far corner, a solitary refuge tucked away from the chaos. She took a steadying breath and began to walk toward it, keeping her head slightly bowed, avoiding the eyes of louder groups, her grip on the tray tightening until her knuckles whitened. Passing a table of girls, she caught the sound of a giggle, uncertain if it was directed at her, yet her stomach tightened all the same, and she quickened her pace as the noise of the cafeteria swelled around her like an oppressive wave. Somewhere behind, a chair scraped sharply across the floor, followed by a boy's voice rising above the din, teasing someone. Emma didn't look back. She had learned that attention in places like this was rarely kind. Approaching the long table where a group of boys sat sprawled out, their bags tossed carelessly to the floor, she could hear their bursts of laughter as one smacked the table to emphasize a joke. One of them glanced up as she passed, a smirk flickering across his face like a spark, and in a single, calculated movement, he stretched his leg into her path. The sole of his shoe hooked the edge of her sneaker, and before she could react, her balance shifted violently. The tray slipped from her fingers, tilting forward as if in slow motion. The sandwich slid free, the apple tumbled and rolled, the milk carton burst with a sharp tear, sending white droplets scattering through the air as plastic utensils clattered like coins against the floor. The hollow crash of the tray hitting tile seemed to pierce through the entire room, and though Emma caught herself before falling completely, the sound of cruel laughter erupted instantly, rolling over her like a cold tide. Faces turned, some covering their mouths in mock sympathy, others openly pointing as if they had just witnessed the most entertaining moment of their day. Heat flooded her cheeks, climbing up her neck until it felt like her skin might ignite. Dropping to her knees, she began fumbling to gather the mess, her fingers trembling as she reached for the soggy sandwich, its bread soaked in milk, the apple now out of sight beneath a distant table where no one moved to help retrieve it. The milk pooled across the floor, cold and sticky against her hands, while the sharp scent mingled unpleasantly with the warm aroma of cooked food lingering in the room. She blinked hard to keep the sting of tears at bay, her vision still blurring as whispers rippled around her, some too faint to catch, others accompanied by snickers that left no doubt they were about her. She focused on stacking the ruined lunch back onto the tray, hair falling like a curtain over her flushed face to shield her from the watching eyes, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her knees ached against the unyielding tile as she brushed a limp piece of lettuce from her sleeve, wishing she could simply vanish. Though the laughter had dimmed slightly, it hadn't vanished, and a few students still stared openly, their amusement gleaming like a challenge. Emma's legs felt heavy, almost unwilling to push her upright, so she kept her head low, concentrating on the simple mechanical task of cleaning up. Somewhere nearby, a chair scraped again, followed by the slow, deliberate approach of footsteps. She didn't dare look up, didn't want to meet another mocking gaze, only to finish, to escape, and to find the quiet table where no one would see the hot tears threatening to fall. In that moment, all she wanted was for the world to stop looking. The footsteps that had drawn closer belonged to a man sitting alone at a table near the tall cafeteria windows, a spot where sunlight streamed in and caught the edges of his dark hair. He wore a suit that spoke of quiet wealth, tailored to perfection, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle even after hours of wear. His tie was loosened slightly, as though he wasn't here to impress anyone, yet every detail about him seemed to command attention. Students had noticed him earlier but assumed he was a visiting parent or some official, not someone worth whispering about for long. His posture was relaxed, but not careless, his hands resting lightly on the edge of his tray, fingers long and steady, the faint glint of a gold watch peeking from beneath his cuff. This man was Alexander Reid, a name known in the world of business headlines, but unknown to most of the teenagers around him. He had been invited by the school board for a midday charity luncheon, a quiet meeting that was supposed to take place in his staff lounge. Yet he had chosen to eat here instead, surrounded by the noisy chaos of youth. Something about the room reminded him of places he hadn't seen in years, cafeterias where the smell of cheap food and the echo of shoes on tile had been part of his daily survival. He didn't care for small talk or forced introductions. Blending into the background was easier, safer. It gave him the chance to watch people when they thought no one important was paying attention. His gaze had been idly following the ordinary rhythm of the lunch hour, drifting over animated conversations and bursts of laughter, until a sudden shift in energy caught his attention. He saw heads turn, faces light up with the kind of cruel amusement he recognized too well. His eyes moved past the smirks and pointing fingers to where a girl, small, quiet, was kneeling on the floor. He noticed the way her shoulders curved inward, the tight line of her mouth, the way her hair fell forward like a shield. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, and something inside him went still. Alexander didn't look at the food or the mess. It was the expressions on the faces around her that drew his attention. He knew that look. He had seen it in schoolyards, boardrooms, even dinner parties, the satisfaction of those who felt safe because someone else was the target. He leaned back slightly, his chair creaking in protest, but his eyes never left the girl. Around him, conversations continued, trays slid across tables, but the sound seemed to dull, replaced by the slow thud of his heartbeat. From where he sat, the sunlight caught faint marks on her sleeve, milk stains, he guessed, and the tremble in her fingers as she reached for the last piece of her lunch. There was nothing dramatic about her movements, no outburst, no shouting. She simply endured. And that, Alexander thought, was worse than anything. 1,000 memories pressed against the edges of his mind, his own hands gathering spilled coins from a cafeteria floor years ago, the burn of humiliation in his chest, the laughter that rang in his ears for days afterward. He had buried those moments under decades of success, but watching her now, they came rushing back. He straightened, pushing his tray a few inches away, the fork clinking softly against the plate. The motion was small but deliberate. His eyes softened just enough to betray the hint of something. Empathy, perhaps, or the quiet fury of a man who hated to see someone cornered. A group of boys sat not far from him, still laughing under their breath, occasionally glancing toward the girl. Alexander didn't need to guess who had caused it. Cruelty often had a certain kind of face. He rested one hand on the table, tapping his index finger lightly in a slow rhythm, his gaze moving from the girl to the rest of the room. No one else seemed inclined to help her. Some avoided looking entirely, unwilling to involve themselves. Others stared openly, as if enjoying the spectacle. It was a scene he had watched play out in different forms his entire life. But here, in this moment, it felt sharper, more personal. The glass panes beside him reflected the movement of the cafeteria, the bright sunlight contrasting with the shadow forming across his expression. He thought briefly of why he had even agreed to attend today's event. Polite networking, a small speech, a check handed over for goodwill. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the way she kept her head down, fighting to finish what she was doing as though the world around her didn't exist. Alexander shifted in his seat, the leg of the chair scraping faintly against the floor. The noise drew no attention, but it felt like a decision. He let his gaze rest on her a moment longer, watching the slow, careful way she placed a crushed sandwich back onto the tray, the way her small frame seemed almost swallowed by the space around her, his lips pressed into a firm line. In that quiet second, before anyone else noticed, Alexander Reid decided that he wouldn't remain just an observer. Something in the way she tried to make herself invisible pulled at a part of him he thought he'd left behind. He could sit here, keep eating, let it pass like so many other moments he had witnessed from a distance, or he could stand. And once Alexander Reid made a decision, he rarely changed his mind. Alexander pushed back his chair with a measured motion, the soft scrape of wood against tile sounding louder in his own ears than in the noise-filled cafeteria. His hands rested briefly on the table, steady, as if anchoring himself before he stood. The decision was final. He would not sit still and let the moment pass. Rising to his full height, his shadow stretched across the floor in the midday light pouring through the windows. His polished black shoes, gleaming under the fluorescent bulbs, clicked in a slow, deliberate rhythm as he began walking toward her. Each step seemed to carve its way through the hum of chatter and the ring of laughter that still bounced off the cafeteria walls. The air in the room felt thicker somehow, though most people kept their voices light, unbothered by the quiet shift happening in the corner. A few students noticed his movement and paused mid-bite, their curiosity flickering to life. They had seen this man earlier, seated quietly, dressed like no teacher or parent they'd ever met. Now he was crossing the room with a focus that made his presence impossible to ignore. Emma didn't look up. Her world was still reduced to the mess before her, the tray, the splattered milk. But the boys at the table, the ones still smirking, noticed. One elbowed the other, muttering something under his breath, as if daring to joke about the suited stranger who was closing in. The laughter swelled, not because anything had become funnier, but because they wanted to keep the spotlight where it was, to make the embarrassment even more. Alexander's face didn't change. His eyes stayed locked on the small figure crouched on the floor, her hands shaking as they reached for the last bit of her ruined lunch. Then, without breaking stride, he stopped just beside her and did something that stopped a few conversations mid-sentence. He knelt down. The sound of his knee touching the tile was small, but the gesture was enormous. He didn't say a word at first. He simply reached forward, his large hands, more accustomed to signing contracts and holding briefcases, picking up the apple that had rolled beneath a nearby table, the smashed sandwich, the crumpled napkins soaked in milk. His expensive cuff brushed against the damp floor, but he didn't care. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if each item deserved care no one else had given it. The cafeteria's noise began to shift, the cruel edge of the laughter softening into a murmur of confusion. Students leaned in to whisper to each other, some pretending to keep eating while sneaking glances at the scene. The boy who had tripped her stiffened in his seat, his smirk fading into something unreadable. Alexander didn't glance at him, yet. Placing the apple gently on the tray, Alexander finally looked up. His gaze swept across the small circle of onlookers, lingering on the boy. The contact was direct, unwavering. The boy's confident posture faltered just slightly under the weight of it. When Alexander spoke, his voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried through the air with an authority that seemed to bypass the noise entirely. "Is this how you treat someone who's already struggling?" he asked, his tone neither loud nor sharp, but so steady that it silenced the nearby whispers. The question hung in the air, heavy, demanding an answer that no one dared to give. The boy shifted in his seat, eyes darting away, but Alexander didn't break the stare. Emma finally glanced up, startled by the man's presence beside her, her breath catching at the sight of someone like him kneeling on the dirty floor, helping her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The sound in the cafeteria had dropped to a strange, expectant quiet, the kind that follows a single action that no one saw coming. Alexander's fingers closed gently around the last crumpled napkin, his hand steady, his expression unchanging. For a moment, it felt as if the entire cafeteria was holding its breath. Alexander rose slowly from his crouched position, the motion unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if he wanted the moment to stretch just long enough for every set of eyes in the cafeteria to stay fixed on him. Straightening to his full height, he slipped his hands to the buttons of his jacket, undoing them with a smooth, practiced movement. The fabric was fine, tailored perfectly to his frame, the kind of jacket that never belonged in a noisy school cafeteria. Yet in that instant, it became something entirely different. Without a word, he eased it from his shoulders, the lining catching the light for a second before he bent slightly toward Emma. She had risen halfway, unsure whether to thank him or shrink further away. But Alexander simply lifted the jacket and draped it around her trembling shoulders. The weight of it was gentle, but the warmth was instant, like a shield placed between her and the stares of the room. She clutched the edges without thinking, her small hands disappearing into the folds. He let his hands fall back to his sides, then turned, not to leave, but to face the room. His gaze swept slowly across the cafeteria, meeting eyes without flinching, the silence deepening as more students realized this was not going to be an ordinary scolding from an adult. His voice, when it came, was steady, but carried a subtle force, like someone used to speaking in rooms where his words shaped decisions. "Do you know who I was when I was your age?" The question was not loud, yet every table nearby seemed to lean in just slightly, as if pulled by the gravity of it. He let the words breathe before continuing, his tone never shifting from that calm certainty. "I was the kid in torn shoes," he said, his gaze distant for a moment, as though the memory was a picture only he could see. "Shoes with holes so wide I stuffed them with cardboard to keep the cold out in winter. I was the one eating the same sandwich every single day because it was all my mother could afford. I sat alone, just like she was sitting before you noticed her, hoping no one would pay me any attention, because attention usually meant trouble." The rustle of wrappers and trays had gone still. Even those at the far edges of the room were turning in their seats now, catching pieces of his words. "I remember what it felt like to be laughed at for something I couldn't change," he continued, his voice firm but never angry. "And I remember thinking, if I ever got to a place where I could stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, I would do it. Every time." He let his eyes move deliberately from one table to another, pausing just long enough for each student to feel the weight of his attention. "It costs you nothing, nothing, to choose kindness over cruelty," he said, the words falling heavy into the silence. The boy who had tripped Emma stared down at his hands, his earlier smugness gone, replaced by a restless shift in his posture. The flush on his face was not from laughter now, but from the heat of being called out without his name even spoken. Alexander didn't linger on him. The shame was already there, doing its work. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone," Alexander added after a pause, "but I am here to remind you that moments like this, these small choices, are what you will remember about yourself years from now. The way you treated someone when you thought no one important was watching says more about you than anything else you'll ever own or achieve." His gaze softened, just slightly, as it landed back on Emma. Strength doesn't always look like standing, tall. Sometimes it's just having the courage to show up again tomorrow, even after a day like this. By now, the only sound in the cafeteria was the faint hum of the lights above. Even the kitchen staff had paused behind the counter, their eyes following the man who had, in the span of a few minutes, turned a room full of noise into a place where every ear was open. Alexander turned from the silent crowd and looked down at Emma, his expression softening in a way that made the tension in the room loosen just a fraction. With a quiet nod, he gestured toward a table tucked away near the far wall, far from the curious eyes still watching. His hand hovered at her back, guiding without forcing, letting her keep the dignity of walking on her own. She clutched the jacket closer around her shoulders as if it were armor, the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the sterile cafeteria air. When they reached the table, Alexander pulled out a chair for her, an act so simple yet deliberate that it made her hesitate for a moment before sitting. He glanced toward the lunch counter and raised a hand, signaling one of the cafeteria staff. His voice was calm, but carried authority when he asked them to bring a fresh tray of food. Not the same sandwich she had lost, but something warm, something that felt like care rather than pity. Emma sat still, unsure where to look, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. The murmur of the cafeteria had begun to rise again in the distance, but here at this table, the noise felt muted, almost like the two of them were in a separate space entirely. Alexander took the seat across from her, leaning forward slightly, elbows resting lightly on the table. "I wasn't always the man you see now," he began, his tone conversational but lined with truth. "I grew up in a house where the lights didn't always stay on. My mother worked herself to exhaustion, but there were nights when dinner was just a piece of bread and some water." Emma's eyes lifted briefly, surprise flickering there. He continued, his gaze steady, not dramatizing, just telling her the truth. "By the time I was your age, I was working nights, stacking boxes in warehouses, cleaning tables in diners, anything to help keep a roof over our heads. I'd come to school half awake, stomach empty, and still, there were people who found time to laugh at me for it." The staff returned with a tray, steaming pasta, a roll, a small dessert, and a drink. Alexander slid it toward her gently, as though it were a gift, not charity. "Eat," he said simply, with a faint, reassuring smile. Emma hesitated, then picked up the fork, her hand still trembling slightly. "You don't have to," she started, but Alexander shook his head. "I want to," he replied, not as a favor, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world. As she took her first bite, he leaned back, watching her with a quiet satisfaction that she was eating at all. "You have something they don't," he said finally, breaking the momentary silence. "Courage. It's not about shouting the loudest or standing in the middle of the room. It's about showing up, about facing people who try to make you small and choosing not to disappear." Her eyes glistened slightly, though she blinked quickly to hide it. "I didn't feel very brave today," she admitted in a whisper. "Courage doesn't always feel like courage," Alexander said gently. "Sometimes it just feels like surviving, but that's what makes it real." The rest of the lunch passed in comfortable quiet, broken only by the occasional word of reassurance from him. When she finished, he reached into his jacket pocket, still draped over her shoulders, and pulled out a small, pristine business card. It was heavy paper, embossed with his name and a phone number. He placed it on the table in front of her. "If you ever need help, with school, with life, with anything, you call me," he said, the words deliberate, as if sealing a promise. Emma looked down at the card, her fingers tracing the raised letters. She didn't fully understand why someone like him was offering this, but she knew she would never forget the moment. Alexander stood then, his chair sliding back softly, and gave her one last nod before preparing to leave the table. The months that followed felt like a quiet transformation, one that started small and spread without anyone quite realizing it. Emma returned to her classes each day, but there was a new steadiness in her steps, a quiet confidence in the way she held her head high. The whispers that once followed her began to fade, replaced by nods of acknowledgement, small smiles from people who had never spoken to her before. Yet, she kept Alexander's business card tucked safely in her notebook, not because she needed to call him, but because it reminded her that someone had believed she was worth standing up for. When the letter arrived, its envelope bearing the seal of the Reid Foundation, she almost didn't believe it was real. Her hands trembled as she opened it, eyes scanning the printed words again and again. A full scholarship, every expense covered, so she could pursue the education she had dreamed of but never dared to imagine possible. Now, months later, she stood on a stage illuminated by warm, golden light. The auditorium was filled with students, parents, teachers, and dignitaries, all gathered for the annual scholarship award ceremony. Her name had been called, and she had walked to the podium with measured steps, the sound of polite applause rising around her. In the front row sat Alexander, his posture relaxed, but his eyes bright with quiet pride. And scattered among the crowd were the same students who had once sat in that noisy cafeteria, laughing at her as she knelt on the floor. She could see them now, their expressions different, softer, almost ashamed but attentive. Emma took a breath, steadying her voice, before speaking into the microphone. "A few months ago," she began, "I thought I was invisible. I thought that if I just kept my head down, maybe I could get through school without too much trouble. But one day, someone proved me wrong." Her words carried across the silent room, drawing everyone in. That day, in the cafeteria, I spilled my lunch. People laughed. I wanted to disappear. But instead of walking past me like I didn't matter, a man I had never met knelt down and helped me. He didn't just pick up food from the floor, he picked me up from a moment I thought would break me. She glanced toward Alexander, who gave her a faint, encouraging nod. That man taught me that kindness is not weakness. It's strength. It's the courage to stand beside someone when no one else will. That moment changed me. And it changed this school. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, but no one interrupted. Today, I'm here because of the Reid Foundation's generosity, but I'm also here because one act of compassion started a chain reaction. Since that day, the cafeteria hasn't been a place of ridicule. It's been a place where people remember that laughter can be cruel and respect can be far louder. She paused, letting the silence linger. We can all choose to be the person who steps forward instead of turning away. We can all make someone's worst day into a moment they'll never forget. Emma's final words were met with applause, not the shallow kind, but the kind that felt full and sincere. As she stepped away from the podium, Alexander rose from his seat, joining in the standing ovation that began to spread through the crowd. When she returned to her seat, the students who had once mocked her now looked at her with something different in their eyes. Not pity, but respect. And though no one said it out loud, she knew they were remembering that afternoon when the sound of laughter had been replaced by the weight of silence, and by the strength of a lesson they would carry far beyond the walls of their school.